Salam. Khosh oumadin. Welcome and good evening. My name is Alexandra Hoffman, and I am an assistant professor of classical Persian literature and culture here at UBC. And I'm here to welcome you. We have come here together at UBC Robson Square, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, who have been the caretakers of these lands before we all came here. It is important, more important now than ever, I think, to keep acknowledging the traditional owners of these lands and other lands as well, lest their and our voices be silenced henceforth. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all tonight for our last Alireza Ahmadian Lecture Series event of this academic year. And I think we're ending on a high note tonight, so I'm very excited. This lecture series was named in memory of Alireza Ahmadian in 2019. Alireza was a proud and devoted UBC alumnus, a supporter of UBC's Department for Asian Studies, and a beloved member of the Iranian Canadian community. I did not know Alireza personally, but I have come to know his brother Hamid, and if they two are alike at all, I can certainly say that he must have been a very enthusiastic and kind-hearted person. We are grateful for the generosity of Alireza's family, friends, and the wider community for the support of the Persian Studies program at UBC. Thank you so much. For tonight, I would like to thank the organizing team, most of all my colleague, Dr. Mostafa Abedinifard, as well as Dr. Navina Naqvi, as well as our behind-the-scenes team consisting of Lisa, Tiffany, Farima, and Razman. Thank you all very much. And now I would like to invite Dr. Ross King to the podium for a few remarks about UBC's Persian Studies program. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ross King.
Thank you, Alexandra, and good evening, everybody. My name is Ross King. I am a professor of Korean language and literature, so I'm somewhat of an imposter in front of all of you. But the reason I'm standing before you is because that I was head of this department from 2008 until 2020 for some 12 years. And our current head, Sherilyn Orba, who will be here later, has asked me, first of all, to send greetings as well as greetings on behalf of herself and the Department of Asian Studies, which I'm very happy to do. But I will also take the opportunity just to reflect for a couple minutes on the history of this initiative in our department to teach Persian language, Iranian studies, and Persianate studies. So back in 2010, 2011, when I was still pretty fresh as head, I was visited by three very ambitious young students from UBC, one of whom was, in fact, Alireza Ahmadian, saying, why are there no courses on Persian language at this university? Why are there no courses on Iranian history at this university? Wouldn't Asian studies be a good home for it? And so in 2011, we, in fact, launched this initiative. And looking back now, almost 15 years, we did learn a few lessons. One lesson is that it takes well over a decade to start any new program. And the second lesson is that it's very hard to fundraise in the Iranian community, especially for a program so new and starting from an absolute deficit on all fronts. So I'm very pleased to share with you that during those intervening years, we managed completely with internal UBC resources to create three tenure-track, let's start with three tenure-track professorial positions in the department. So you've already heard about Mostafa Abedinifard, about Navina Naqvi, you've just heard from Alexandra, and now, of course, we have Hessam Dehqani as well. What happened was that just as COVID was hitting all of us, we sort of made one last final push to try and create a fourth professorship in classical Persian literature. And that was, in fact, a collaborative effort between the university, with funding from the president's office, and the community, a sort of 50-50 matching funds type situation. And that did successfully lead to the creation of our fourth professorship in classical Persian literature and culture, which Alexandra holds. At that final meeting, we were just coming out of COVID, we were all still wearing masks, and the donors and stakeholders from UBC sort of got together, and it was at that meeting, in fact, that we had a very inspiring and encouraging sort of mini lecture piped into us over Zoom by none other than Professor Abbas Amanat. Basically telling the donors and the UBC stakeholders, in effect, what a precious opportunity this was, both for the Iranian community here in Vancouver, as well as for UBC to be undertaking this initiative. And he gave a couple important pieces of advice during his remarks. In addition, by the way, to emphasizing how, in fact, Asian Studies really is an appropriate home for this program. But his two pieces of advice were, one, that we should try to create a minor in Persian, Iranian, and Persianate studies, so that interested individuals, and especially 1.5 generation and second generation Iranian Canadians, could in fact add a minor to their degree, in addition to whatever they were doing as their primary specialization. So that was one of his pieces of advice. And then the second piece of advice was that he strongly urged us to continue to push for an additional fifth professorship, which would be in early modern Iranian history. And so at this point, I'm also pleased to share with you that I think it was 2 years ago that we did, in fact, successfully get a new minor approved in Persian, Iranian, and Persianate studies. The name is very long. And that is thanks in no small part to our colleague Hessam Dekhani, who almost single-handedly now has built for us a full 4-year undergraduate program in Persian language, and does much on top of that, but he spearheaded the effort to really get this pushed through UBC's very tedious and very bureaucratic processes for such things. So I want to close by simply saying that, or maybe sharing with you or reminding you that in some ways what we've managed to do in the last 15 years with this program is actually kind of a miracle, kind of a small miracle. I think, and Professor Amanat, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there are extremely few universities in North America or in Europe that can boast 4 tenure-track positions in the sort of Persianate sphere. So we're lucky on that. But we do have much more that we can achieve and much more work to do. And as, again, probably you all know if you read the news, Canadian universities lately, and UBC is no exception, are facing very dismal financial prospects for the foreseeable future. So any future progress will have to continue to build on that successful partnership that led us to the position that Alexandra now holds. And we all do very look forward to working with the Iranian community to make these things happen. Thank you so much. And now I would like to ask Mustafa to please come up to the stage and introduce our guest speaker.
Hello, everyone, and good evening. Asr hamigi bekhair. For those of you whom I haven't had the chance to meet, my name is Mustafa Abedini-Fard, and I'm an assistant professor of modern Persian literature and culture at the Asian Studies Department at UBC, here at UBC. Before we begin, I would like to say a very happy belated Nowruz and Happy New Year, of course, Persian New Year, to all those who celebrate. It's really wonderful to be gathering at the start of this new season. A quick note before I go on with introducing our dear guest tonight. A quick note about tonight's format. So after the lecture, we'll open the floor to Q&A. And that part of the evening, of course, will be moderated by my dear colleague, Dr. Navina Naqvi, our historian, whose area is also partly well, mainly actually related to Persianate Islamic cultures of South Asia here at UBC. So feel free, please, to save your questions for that portion of the program. And now it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Abbas Amanat, the William Graham Summer Professor Emeritus of History at Yale University. A graduate of Alborz High School, Dr. Amanat received his BA from the University of Tehran in 1971 and his doctorate in history from the University of Oxford in 1981. He taught at Yale University from 1983 until 2021 and has authored foundational works on modern Iranian history, the Qajar era, Shiism, and the history of the Persianate world. Now, I should say everything that I just read comes from Dr. Amanat's very modest and humble official biography that he gave us, but if you allow me, I would like to add just a few words of my own. Dr. Amanat is truly among the finest historians of our time, meticulous, critical, and expansive in his vision. He stands out as a historiographer who not only brings scholarly depth and objectivity to the archival record, but also illuminates the history of ideas that have shaped Iran and Iran's modernity. His work bridges rigorous academic analysis with accessible storytelling, which is something I would say that few historians manage so eloquently, especially Iran historians. Alongside his many academic contributions, including, of course, his landmark, most recent History of Modern Iran, and a collection of essays translated into Persian, Ahd Qajar va Sodai Farang. I would especially like to draw the attention of our audience, many of whom I'm sure would like to hear Dr. Amanat speaking in Persian as well. I would like to draw your attention to a series of 8 sessions of lectures, basically produced with the collaboration of ASU Institute online, and it's available on YouTube. I had the pleasure of watching these talks myself, and for those in the audience, again, who are interested, in this series, he offers, Dr. Amanat, an original conceptual overview of Iranian history through a set of thought-provoking binary themes such as Marz o Boom, border and homeland, Din o Doulat, religion and state, Darbar o Divan, court and bureaucracy, or kingship and ministership, etc. It's a powerful example of how Dr. Amanat brings historical depth and accessibility together in a format that speaks to both the scholarly and broader audiences. It's truly an honor to welcome him here with us this evening, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Amanat, Dr. Abbas Amanat. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, let me start by, first of all, thanking the audience and the speakers before me, and very flattering terms in which I was introduced. I appreciate that very much. And I hope my lecture is not going to be a disappointment, since I just heard from Dr. Ross King that my advice has been something of value to the development of the Iranian Studies program. This is not the first time I'm speaking here to an audience in British Columbia, in Vancouver. A number of other times I've been a guest to other events. And I think in one of them, I might have actually touched on the topic that we're going to listen to today, or we're going to hear. But this focus probably is a little bit different today. It's more on Iran and Central South Asia in the turn of the 19th century, around 1800. And as a matter of fact, this is part of an ongoing project of mine called Circa 1800, which is a kind of an ambitious work, but more interpretive in a sense, to try to draw attention to something which modern historians, and by which I mean historians of the 19th and 20th centuries, tend to pay less attention, of a period of time around between 1790s and 1810s, when virtually the destiny of the region that can be called the Eastern Hemisphere, or a large part of the Eastern Hemisphere, or I would call it a little bit more, thank you so much, a little bit more poetically, if you like, between Nile and the Ganges. That's the span, geographical span between Egypt and really Eastern India, Indian subcontinent. I have to be a little bit more accurate, or in the from what was known in the older days and better known for the Iranians, Hindustan, which was the term referred to the whole of the subcontinent up to perhaps the British arrival, and certainly from 1830s onwards. So this is a important period in a sense, as I said. Not only the fate of the whole region seemed to have been shaped from that time, but in effect it had a kind of a long-term echoes in the history of the region that probably even up to now we witness. Probably it's a curious coincidence, I cannot say if it is felicitous or ominous, that today there is the first session of the the Islamic Republic of Iran negotiating with the United States. And if you look at the kind of, not necessarily what is on the agenda, but the circumstances which brings this about, it's not surprising to see that perhaps the origins of it can go back really 2.25 of a century earlier, from the 1800s onwards. That's where, in a sense, you can see the earliest example of, as far as Iran is concerned. I mean, the Ottoman case is a little bit different, since the Ottomans have been in contact and in conflict with Europe from the earlier centuries. But as far as Iran is concerned, this is the first time that Iran's bipolarity, I don't want to use this term in a cynical context, but the way that Iran's encountered for the first time with the two Christian powers in its two frontiers, with Russia in the north for the first time, as expansionist power, imperialist expansionist power moving southward, and with the British India, or British Empire, in not only in South Asia, but in the Persian Gulf. So Iran, all of a sudden, almost one might say, at the very end of the 18th century, found itself with these two new neighbors, and with very demanding, very dangerous, in a sense, neighbors in its both frontiers. And Iran, for centuries before that, in the old period of the early modern times, that's from 16th century onwards, from the rise of the Safavids, and even probably one can say the late Timurid period, Iran has always had a kind of a two-frontier world in its east and west. In the west, it was the Ottoman world. In the east, it was the Uzbeks and the other entities, as we know very well, the Afghans later on in the 18th century, in the beginning of the 18th century. That really made Iranians very conscious of their two frontiers, east-west. Now, all of a sudden, in the 19th century, in the very end of the 18th century, they begin to realize that the real nemesis are no longer in the east-west, but it's the north-south. And they had to handle this by a regime, by dynasty, that is the Qajars, that managed recently to come to power. And it's among, by the way, very few dynasties that emerged in that time period, that's the late 18th century onwards, that managed to survive and continue up to the early 20th century. Very few other new entities you would see that are not going to be completely taken over as colonies by the imperial powers, European imperial powers. Iran, in that case, is somewhat an exception. And part of it is because of the circumstances, mostly the strategic position, geographical position that it was in, that in a sense allowed it to emerge as what European powers used to call the buffer state, and use that in a kind of a more reference to Iran in a, one might say, not very friendly fashion. It's a kind of a minor power. But in a sense, it was a blessing in disguise that Iran became a buffer state because it helped it to survive through the very, very difficult time. One should bear in mind that the period that we are talking about, and I'm going to show you some slides in a moment, so bear with me with this relatively long introduction, but there are a couple of points that should be mentioned. First of all, this is a period of global conflict in the region, not in the region, but worldwide. The period between the late 18th century, from the 1890s, even 1880s, 1780s, all the way to the 18th teens, is a period of extraordinary European conflict between European powers. You would see after the French Revolution the rise of France as a major power during Napoleonic period. You would see British imperial expansion by East India Company and otherwise worldwide. You see the American-British conflict that ultimately leads to the independence of the United States and the continuity of that war all the way to 1812. You would see that a number of other theaters, there are confrontations between European powers, and the rise of Russia as probably the greatest military power in the whole of the 19th century. That's the beginning of it that we will see at the very late 18th century. By some estimates, as a result of the conflicts between probably 1795 and 1815, there's a period of 20 years, there were at least 5 million casualties in terms of the dead, and mostly dead, because in the older days, when you were some wounded in a battlefield, most likely you would die. There wasn't ways to try to save you, as it is the case today. And this is a very remarkable figure, because the population of Europe, as a matter of fact, increased in the course of the 18th century from 100 million to 200 million. So it's a very remarkable increased population, and I would mention why. Whereas the 5 million that was lost in the course of the conflicts of this period was the youngest and the most active, the most, in a sense, productive sector of the population that was lost during the war. Just give you one example. During the Russian campaign, Napoleonic Russian campaign, around 1805 to probably 1807, 1808, the period of the Russian campaign, the French lost 500,000 casualties. It's an enormous figure, 500,000 casualties, due to either action or pandemics or the loss in other ways. There's this huge number of figures you can say about the Russian side as well. So it's nothing new about the issue of the expansion. It's nothing new about the issue of the casualties. What we also noticed that in the case of Iran, this expansion necessarily was not as probably dramatic and as brutal as it would have been in the case of many other theaters of war in Europe or for that matter, elsewhere. What Iranians noticed during the reign of Fath Ali Shah, and I'm going to show you this slide in a moment, is that not only Russia from the time of Peter the Great in the early part of the 18th century, but of course later on under Catherine, see the emergence of Russia from the north into the Caucasus, the northern Caucasus, and then gradually moving southward in the direction of Georgia, Gorgestan, and then of course by the end of the first round of the war, most of the part by 1813, most of what is today considered as the Republic of Azerbaijan, Republic of Armenia, and the Republic of Georgia were all taken as provinces of very, very valuable provinces of Iran. And then, of course, that loss was sealed completely by the end of the second round of the Russo-Persian Wars that in 1828 led into the Turkmenchay Treaty and the permanent loss of those provinces to Iran. By Iranian nationalist narrative, that's the greatest disaster in the world. But as a matter of fact, if you compare to other circumstances, you will see that Iran was relatively lucky. I was reading Tipu Sultan's memoirs. He is the son of son of Nasruddin Shah, not son of Fath Ali Shah, because there's another Tipu Sultan under that name. But he had written his memoirs in late 19th century, most of it hunting. But occasionally he talks about other things as well. And one of the things he says, we are lucky that we ended up with the Turkmenchay Treaty, because the rest of Iran was not run over by the European powers. And in that respect, to some extent, he's right, because that could have been the fate of Iran if that kind of balance between the two empires as neighbors of Iran would not have maintained. Or the fact that often has been ignored is the fact that Iranians managed to play their hands rather skillfully, despite all that you hear about the Qajars being incompetent and corrupt and most of the time in the Andaruns enjoying themselves and so forth. Maybe much of it is true, but at the same time you see also a certain degree of inevitable understanding of world politics and the fact that they had to play their hands rather skillfully in order to be able to preserve some kind of an equivalent of balance between the two powers. So that's the story that we are going to look at the earlier part of the 19th century. Where is this other gentleman that you don't have the image, but here you have him here. Mr. Tipu Soltan is in this story. Oh, we went to the first. Okay, we cannot see the, okay. What I'm going to talk about in the limited period that we have is that how Iran had various options under Fath Ali Shah, and how we ended up with the option that ultimately, in my opinion, was the wise one. Why it was wise? Because Iran compromised. And that's where I said there's a coincidence with what you see today. What Iran recognized is that under Fath Ali Shah, that of the best of the two powers, it's better to side with the one that the chances of aggression and basically military takeover of Iran is less than the other one. And that was realized from very early, that Russians are sitting on the north. They are expansionists. They have been expansionists ever since the 11th century. And as you can see, they still are. the chances that they may lose more of Iran is quite a serious possibility, as it was indeed throughout the 19th century. And in the south, the British had kind of a negotiated empire in South Asia. And this negotiated empire, bits and pieces, was put together with a lot of brutality. I would not undermine that one, but not with the kind of an army that they could easily invade a country such as Iran, which is slightly beyond their immediate interest. But nevertheless, during the course of the 19th century, and particularly in the earlier part, the desire to pressurize Iran through negotiation, through incentives and disincentives, was very strong. And at the same time, while these two options were present or absent, I mean, one worse than the other, it was the period which I refer to as the French interlude. That's the time of the Napoleon. You would see from 1805 to 1809. There's a period that Napoleon decides that Iran could be a good ally, because through Iran and Ottoman Empire, it would eventually be able to reach northern India, which was a very unrealistic consideration, but like many other of Napoleon's war or strategic plans, that was also fairly unrealistic, as it proved in reality. But it made the British very worried, very extremely worried. So in that matter, Iran tried to use that option, that card, in order to reduce pressures on its frontiers by the Russians and by the British in the south. But in reality, it turned out that the promises by Napoleon, as it was mostly the case in other examples, was fickle and unrealistic and very disloyal. So shortly after a period of time, he decided to shift alliance from Iran into Russia. And we have a bunch of letters by Fath Ali Shah in Persian written to Napoleon, in which he very bitterly complains about the behavior of the French. But the loss of the French, in a sense, ultimately makes him to make a decision to come to terms with the British. So where is Tipu Sultan in all of this story? As we will see, I would show you in some of these slides where he comes into the story for us and how the end of the story has some repercussions for the future of Iran's decision. Well, this is a map from my Iran book that shows that how Qajars in the very late period were successful in order to reunify Iran, mostly under the founder of the dynasty, Agha Muhammad Khan, that unfortunately has a very negative reputation, but I think Iranians are very much indebted to him because, in a sense, unification of Iran is very much the product. As you can see in this map, there are a number of campaigns that he fought all his life, and as a result of that, we have what we would see today in Iran with the frontiers more or less as we have today. Although under the Safavids, Iran had a great imperial integrity, but that was lost in the course of the 18th century. Okay, before we come here. What the Qajars' early achievements were was the fact that they managed to create a relatively, given the limited resources that they had, a relatively stable country, state in power. Iran, in the course of the 18th century, in contrast to Europe, had enormous amount of loss of population. Iran was depopulated in the period. Partly, as I've argued in my book, for those of you who are interested, for environmental reasons. Part of it because of the civil war that was fought for 70 years inside, from the end of the Safavid period in 1722 up to the rise of the Qajars, or consolidation of the Qajars in 1797. So it's a long period of time, with some spells in between of the Zand period that the south was prosperous. But for the rest of the period, including Nader Shah, is a very, very period of great suffering for Iranian people and the loss of population. So you have a loss of population in Iran at the time, but probably at the very beginning of the 19th century, around 1800, no more than 4 million was the population of Iran. So you can imagine that encounter with great powers, what it meant for a country which had no economic resources in terms of the loss of agriculture during that time period for environmental reasons, coming of the tribal powers in the periphery toward the center that was also considered as very problematic, if not destructive. And the third one, because of the entire state system has been interrupted during this period. Now, by the time of Fath Ali Shah and his coming to power, despite all of the problems that Iran faced, you can see that there is a rise of a new period of prosperity, relative prosperity. For those of you who are interested in construction and architecture, as a matter of fact, the period of Fath Ali Shah is one of the most fruitful period. There are lots of buildings that were constructed, mosques, palaces, gardens during this time period. Cities grew, population grew. So it was relatively a period of calm in the very early part of the, very late part of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. And the emergence of a new imperial ideology under Fath Ali Shah. You see, Fath Ali Shah, contrary to his uncle, Agha Muhammad Khan, who was a really tribal, nomadic state builder, state founder, he was an empire builder. So we would see that he, in a sense, develops a new, reinvents the Iranian old tradition of kingship. So in certain respects, even with inspirations from ancient Iran, particularly Sasanian Iran, or maybe even earlier on, because most of his youth, he was in the court of Karim Khan Zand in Shiraz. And he learned a great deal, as a matter of fact, in Shiraz. It's kind of a Shiraz nationalism, Fars nationalism. And most likely had seen the Persepolis, he must have seen some of the other rock reliefs of the Sasanian period in Aksharastam, etc. So he had some memory. It's not without a reason. You see, near Tehran, he has rock reliefs in the style of an imperial power with his Chianid crown, with his very kind of majestic feature, and the hunting as the real preoccupation of the kings. And even more so, in the great paintings or the panels, as you can see, there are 4 panels that in the Negaristan Palace around 1812 was painted by Abdullah Khan Kashani, which was the royal painter of, second royal painter of Fath Ali Shah's court. And is a very remarkable piece of political history, if you like to see, in terms of the way that it positions the ruler vis-a-vis those that attended in the occasion of the Nowruz of 1812. This is the public audience of 1812. This is the way that it is. You see at the center of it, as I was pointing out, Fath Ali Shah in a kind of a very majestic feature, sitting on this throne that later on became as the peacock throne, at his own time was known as the sun throne, Takht Khurshid, and with his princes, 6 of the most major princes of the royal family, including Abbas Mirza on one side, and Muhammad Ali Mirza Daulat Shah on the other. Why this is significant? Because Fath Ali Shah, in a sense, one might say, single-handedly created a new nobility. That is a nobility out of the number of sons and daughters that he gave birth to. As a matter of fact, I remember when I first looked, when I was in Oxford, in the Guinness Book of Records, Fath Ali Shah was mentioned as the person who had the largest number of the wives and largest number of sons and daughters. Sons, that's the important point. He created basically a new aristocracy that he sent over to the provinces in order to maintain that old tradition of the guarded domains, Mamluk Mahruse Iran, that he actually reinvented. That was the way that he managed to control the provinces through his sons, rather than relying on the unreliable chiefs of the either Qajar tribe or the other tribes in the provinces. So this was a very skillful. That's why you would see the 6 sons on the 2 sides of the king, in a sense, reflect a kind of a balance, because the 2 of them, if I can show you, this is Muhammad Ali Mirza Daulat Shah, that was the great governor of Western Iran, based in Kermanshah, and this is Abbas Mirza, which is the vice regent and the governor of the Azerbaijan province. Both of them most important, most prosperous provinces, and the other sons. So in a sense, it shows a balance. The painting shows a balance between the 2 sides of the, because the 2 were rivals, as a matter of fact. They remained rivals to the very end. Then you would see also a number of minor princes here, and you see some of the major courtiers carrying various elements of majestic power. His sword, his other elements that you would see that he's carrying. But more important than that are the 2 panels on the sides of the Negaristan Palace that unfortunately has been destroyed by the very late 19th century. I mean, the latest that we know that there is an Iran Bastan museum, there is a copy of this painting, and there are other copies of it as well, but the original one was destroyed. It was around 1900 that we have that. Why this is important? Because the sense of a balance of power that I've been talking about is more visible in these 2. On the one hand, on the right side, which is the top one, you would see a number of nobilities, members of the nobility, including also a member of the representatives of the neighboring powers or neighboring minor dynasties, including from, believe it or not, from the Wahhabis of the Arabian Peninsula. There are representatives here. From Yemen as well, from Herat, that's the Afghanistan, from Kabul, from the princes of the Gurjistan dynasties that were still loyal to the Iranians, and a number of the others. All of them can be recognized at the top. And as a matter of fact, the gentleman here, oh, I'm sorry. This is the painter himself who put it himself here, Abdullah Khan Naqashbashi. But the rest of them, as you look at them, the most significant is the presence of the European powers. You can see here, I'm sorry. Here you can see the 3 representatives of the British or East India Company. That, as a matter of fact, this is rather anachronistic. But in this particular case, you can see all the 3 representatives were in Tehran in around 1912 or 1910, 1911. but they were included in the painting. This is the first one. This is Sir John Malcolm, that in a moment we're going to talk more about him. In the center is Sir Gore Ouseley, that was a representative of not East India Company from India, but from the British Crown from London. And that showed, to some extent, the significance of Iran in this time period as far as the power rivalries are concerned. And the third one is Sir Harford Jones, that was British consul, first in Iraq, then in Iran. The long history has written a magnificent history, and the most interesting, I think, in all three of examples. All three of them knew Persian well, and were chosen and were sent over to the court of Fath Ali Shah in order to woo him to come to the side of the British. On the other hand, you would see on the left panel, by the way, the right and the left, as you know, in Persian political culture means those who are favorable, those who are a little bit less favorable. On the left panel, you see the three representatives of the Ottomans here, which were the traditional nemesis of the Iranians, and the three French. This is General Gardin, that was sent by Napoleon. One is Monsieur Joubert, who is the first one who was sent to Iran, and the third one whose name escapes me. Probably it's in here, I saw somewhere I mentioned his name as well. But it's interesting that they were put together on the left panel. And this is a little bit anachronistic, because by the time that the British representatives, first Malcolm, arrived in Iran in 1810, Fath Ali Shah has asked the French mission to leave the capital, basically because he wanted to break relations with Napoleon in order to be able to bring back the British, in order to be able to play the game of who would be the strongest supporter for him against the Russians. As you can see in the entire painting, the Russians are missing. The greatest and the most powerful neighbor of Iran is not represented in this painting. And the reason for that is very clear, because Iran was in the war between 1805 and 1813, when the Golestan Treaty was concluded, that this is right at the very end of the war. And obviously, you would not portray your enemy in this process. But what you would see here, this is where you can see the Russians. These are the 2 pages from the book of Shahanshahnameh, which was produced in the style of Shahnameh of Ferdowsi by Fath Ali Khan Sabah, the poet laureate of the court of Fath Ali Shah. It's a very thick, major work which basically exaggerates most of the time the great achievements of Fath Ali Shah, particularly his exploits in the war against the Russians. But the moment that it's portrayed here is one of the very rare examples of Iranians winning against the Russians. That is when the commander, the Russian commander Sisianev, that in Persian was referred to as Eshpakhtar, was killed in the battle. And Iranians considered this as a great success. Though it was very temporal, and afterwards they lost in the battles. As a matter of fact, it was such an important event that in the Shahanshahnameh, it was portrayed twice. Once with Fath Ali Shah as being the commander-in-chief of the Iranian forces, and once with Abbas Mirza as being the commander-in-chief of the Iranian forces. So that shows the event was so significant as far as the poet laureate was concerned. So this is from a copy of this poem, this long poem. It's very as long as, almost as long as Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. And as a matter of fact, stylistically speaking, is a very accomplished piece of poetry. It's not something that you can look at it and consider it as a secondary matter. This is produced in the early 19th century. And as a matter of fact, there are numerous scenes of the Fatali Shah's interior, the Andarun court, with the women and the musicians and so forth. So it's both sides of Razm and Bazm, the fight and the feast has been reflected in this. This is a copy that was given by Fatali Shah to Sergor Ozli when he was in Iran. Now it's in Bodleian Library in Oxford. And in effect, it was given as an example of the grandiose and the power of the Persian ruler. And we should not forget, around this time, Iran still was looked upon by the British as well as by the French and by the Russians to some extent as a major power. This was before the time that it was being defeated in the war completely, and the Treaty of Golestan basically shifted, particularly later on, 1828, Treaty of Turkmenchay completely changed the image of Iran. So if you compare the very early 19th century with the latter part of the, from 1830s onwards, you see the accounts of the Europeans that are writing about Iranians are very different. The view of Fatali Shah is very different. The view of the Persian court is very different. The view of the Iranians is very different. There's much more, you see that Orientalist kind of stereotype emerges in the literature of the period. Whereas in the earlier parts, it's considered as a great empire that sits between the Ottomans and South Asia. So it was considered as a major power. Now, if you look at this particularly part of the painting that I showed you, the panel with the three representatives, the British representatives, and next to them on the right is actually two of the great administrators of the early Qajar period, both of them remarkable figures. One of them, Mirza Shafi, the Sadr Azam, the chief minister. The other one next to him is Mirza Isa Farahani, who is the father of Mirza Abul Qasim Farahani, and the kind of a great administrators in a sense that the Qajar is very much indebted to them. That's one of the achievements of the early Qajars too. They incorporated much of the divan, the administration, of the Zand period and of the Safavid period into their own administration. So the view that we usually have of the early Qajars of being incompetent, this is not the case. If you look at the literature of the period, if you look at the correspondence of the period, you'll see that they are very capable administrators, that they're facing with this great power with the least amount of resources, and they're aware of it, in a sense. Okay, the person on the, here on the, what would it be, on the right, here, is one of the two representatives, as we know from some copies of this painting, called Abdur Rahman, I believe, if I'm not wrong, the representative of Tipu Sultan that comes to Iran much earlier than this painting. He arrives in Tehran in around 1799. There were two representatives that were sent by Tipu Sultan, the ruler of Mysore kingdom of central and southern South Asia, central and southern Hindustan, that in the hope of creating some kind of an alliance against the British, as he was under tremendous amount of pressure in the latter part of the 18th century, from 1870s, 1880s, first his father and then himself, of the British that considered Tipu as a major threat, because he, with the help of the French, the last of the French that were at one time in control of the southern part of the subcontinent, he managed to actually create some kind of a force of resistance against the British that we're very afraid of. as you can see, the representatives arrived in Iran rather late. But by the time he reached Tehran in 1799, the British got rid of Tipu Sultan altogether. They made the final of the 3 series of battles that they fought against Tipu, and eventually get rid of the Mysore and installed in his place their own favorable ruler, or kind of ruler. This is Tipu Soltan himself. This is this is his territory. That his father, Haidar Ali, and then himself, managed to consolidate, and over the period of time, as you can see, is a very strategic location at the very tip of the Indian subcontinent, with trade this is the Mysore, and this is all the regions around it that were taken already by the British. And with the help of the Nizam of Deccan and the Deccan kingdom that came on to the side of the British, as a matter of fact, rather peacefully, and fought against Tipu. There's a story, it's a very long story. I don't want here to talk too much about it. And of course, what is known about him, Tipu was known because of his, Tipu, by the way, in the local language of South Asia, Kandyan, I believe, means tiger. So this is what you see here is a tiger that is mauling a British soldier. And that he commissioned this. This is an organ, as you can see on the side of it. And when you play this organ, it's the roar of a tiger that is killing its victim. And that was, in effect, a reflection of his attitude towards the British. And this was apparently the son of, or the way that it was portrayed, apparently the son of the major commanders of the British forces in southern India. So this is, by the way, Victoria and Albert Museum in London. If next time you've been there, you may want to actually look at the section of Tipu Sultan. There is a whole part of the museum dedicated to that. And why they're here, why they're in Victoria and Albert, is the fact that the British basically, after they sacked his capital, Srinapatam, they completely looted his entire palace and all his belongings and all his documents, all his news, all his correspondence and everything else. And with a sense of vengeance. That's very interesting, the way that the British treated him. And part of the reason for the vengeance was that some of the officers that fought in the battlefield against Tipu Sultan were sent over from Americas when they were fighting against the New Republic, and including Cornwallis, the most famous of them. It was basically because they were defeated in the New War against the Americans. They were sent over, and they came here with a vengeance to really take their revenge against the Indians. And Tipu is an excellent example of that, because it was basically the last point of resistance in southern part of the subcontinent. If you move on further, you see relations with Iran was a long one from South Asia. And there is a Persianate culture in South Asia, as we'll see in a moment. The lingua franca, as in most of the Indian subcontinent, was Persian. So much of the material that you see was produced in this period are all in Persian. And this not only is the language, but it's the trade that along the western coast of Hindustan goes all the way up to the Persian Gulf. And this was a trade that was going on. And as a matter of fact, Tipu Sultan had a dual interest. One was a strategic, military. The other one was trade. He wanted to develop trade as a source of income for his kingdom. Now, I was looking to see what the Iranians were saying about him. This is one of the documents, one of the, actually it's not published, this is in British Library. This is the Tarikh Jahan Ara. It's one of these universal histories that were written in the Fath Ali Shah period in 1212 and 1213, 1799, very early, by Muhammad Sadiq Marwazi, who was the Waqai Nagar, who was the historian, official historian of the court. And he has a passage that I have translated here in which he actually says that the emissaries by Tipu Sultan were sent to Iran in order to warn Iranians against the British, as it says here, the English infidels have overcome the Muslim people and are plundering the Muslim land. Kafare Angarus, that's English, that's in Britain. بر طبقه اسلام غالب آمده و بر ولایت مسلمین دست تطاول و یغما گشادند. That is part of the message that was sent to Fath Ali Shah. And is among the very few accounts that we have of these early emissaries that came to the court. Part of the reason, because later on, the historians of the later period didn't want to particularly anger the British. So they softened up the earlier mission by Tipu Sultan. Another account, the Tarikh Zulqarnain, this is recently been published by Fazlullah Khavari. This is again one of the early accounts of the period. The section that may be of interest is that it says, requesting, that is Tipu, requesting that the Iranian state persuade the beneficent government of England not to attack Tipu Sultan's territories and leave him unmolested. That is the message that again comes from Tipu Sultan. Now, it was also interesting for me in one of the manuscripts of something which is referred to as the Shabrangnameh, which is another kind of more popular versions of Shahnameh that was produced, I think, in the 18th century. I'm not sure. Apparently, this was produced in the kingdom of Mysore. And what is so interesting about it is the way that Rostam was portrayed as he's slaying the black thief Al-Haq in this epic. And as you can see here, the black demon is represented as the example of the British Empire. Obviously, Rostam is a representative of Tipu Sultan. So this, again, is part of the popular literature of the time to portray the British vis-a-vis the Tipu Sultan. This is in the office library in London, but I haven't seen the manuscript itself, but I saw pictures of it. So I'm not actually quite sure exactly about what's the circumstances for this, but that's what I understood is the case. And then, of course, Tipu created a whole cult of anti-British, or in a sense, Islamic solidarity against the British that you can see from the 1770s onward in many, a pair of pistols, his sword, and all the verses that he has written on the sword all reflects this kind of an attitude of combat against the British. And with the head of the sword, with the handle of the sword in the shape of a shape of a tiger, which is again a representative of Tipu Sultan. So it's basically a whole tradition that we can see here developing during his time. Or you can see that he created basically a new calendar. That's also another interesting thing about him. He created a calendar called Mauludi with very parts, it's a lunar solar because it's still lunar, but it has also a kind of a solar component to it. And on the other side, in Persian, Zarb Darussaltaneh Mushtari, which is a reference to his own capital, Shirnapatam, referred to as Mushtari. And then you can see in his summer palace, poetry is all in Persian, all around. Or you can see, for instance, in some of the manuscripts that survive from his time, this by an Iranian, very influential Iranian munshi of his, so Zainul Abidin Shushtari, from the clan of the Shushtaris that were all very influential in South Asia, very influential, very powerful. And what is this called? Qawaid Tipu Soltan. So he wrote basically a kind of a treatise in which he created some kind of an ideology based on kind of an Islamic resistance against the unbelievers. So you see every page of this has some references, and there are a variety of things in it, including, for instance, various songs that he composed for the troops during the course of the battle to perform. And a variety of other interesting things that Zainul Abidin produces in Moscow. The British were very, before the capture of Shirnapatam in 1799, were very preoccupied. They thought that this is a document that is basically all the secrets of Tipu Sultan is in this one by this in Iranian Zainul Abidin, who has written some other important works, interesting work. And then more important than all of it is that the secret kind of Khabnameh, the account of the dreams of Tipu Sultan that he apparently, as you can see, this is his own handwriting in Persian. It's written all of this. It's recently been published in, not so recently, 1970s were published in Pakistan. And I found it very interesting because if you read some of these dreams, they are very revealing in the sense of his ambitions, of what he was after, and how many of these images, many of his heroes are basically coming from this Persianate world. As for instance, in this one, which he sees Saadi, the poet, in one of his dreams. And sometimes they references to the poets. He sees Nizami in his dreams, sees Saadi in his dreams, and they all basically give him counsel as how has to conduct himself in the manner of fighting against the British or against the other rivals. So it's not the only one. And most significant of all, probably it was here or somewhere else, he talks about in these dreams that he eventually would be able to prevail over the British and liberate the kingdom of the Gurkhanids that's the Mughal of India, and revive them, because at this stage, the Gurkhanids were the last gasp. They were about to disappear under the British. As a matter of fact, only 3 years after in 1803, I think, or 1805, I'm not sure, the British managed to take over Delhi and turn the last of the Mughal emperors of Delhi as basically a subservient minor figure under their control, a kind of a vassalage that they created. So in a sense, Tipu wanted to bring back the glory of the Mughal Empire. And that's why it was so important for the British after the conquest of Srinapatam and killing Tipu to translate some of his letters in English as a kind of a propaganda against Tipu Sultan. And also selected letters, as you can see here, published in 1811, very early. And why they were so afraid of him was the fact that he proposed a kind of a grand alliance against the British with a certain strategic plan. That's, as you can see, first in the 1780s, he sent an emissary to Istanbul. We have the account of the travel of that emissary to Istanbul, that he invites the Sultan of Ottoman Empire to come to his rescue, to his help. And the Ottomans don't want to get any trouble because they have enough trouble for themselves vis-a-vis the Europeans. So they don't want to get involved in anything else. So the second mission that he sends, that you saw the emissary on the paintings that I showed you on the panel, that he sends to Tehran, to Kabul, where the last of the Zaman Shah, the last of the Duranid rulers of Afghanistan, was ruling over the Durrani Empire. You'll see another one was sent to Masqat, and all of this, which I haven't, yes, I've shown it, the one to the Masqat, to the Oman of today, in the hope that there would be an alliance by these Muslim powers in order to, through Afghanistan, to attack northern India, that's Punjab region, here, to Punjab, coming down to Punjab, in order to distract the British attention from the south to the north, because they were supporting the Sikh dynasty in the north, in Punjab region, and they wanted to, he wanted the British to send their forces to the north so they would be relief on him in the south, and he wanted to persuade the Fath Ali Shah and the others to do so. And more important than that, this is the time in 1797 when Bonaparte, before the time of his become the emperor, he, under the rubric of French expedition, basically invaded Egypt and took over in a number of very brutal battles, took over Egypt. He writes a number of letters, that is Tipu Sultan, writes a number of letters to Bonaparte and invites him to come through the Red Sea to South India in order to support him against the British. And he persuades him by saying, you have lost the war against the British in Pondicherry. This is the time for you to come back and reconquest the region in the south. So it's very interesting. It was kind of opportunistic at the same time. It was not all for the greatness of Islam. Sometimes it was for the fact that he found the French as an ally against the British. So all of this, unfortunately, didn't seem to work. Because what concerned Iranians, as far as, okay, I'm sorry. What concerned Iranians, most importantly, was the presence of the Russians in the north. That's where the concern. And that's why they wanted to concentrate their efforts in order to prevent from the loss of the Caucasus to the Russians. Therefore, Tipu Sultan was a secondary matter for them, in effect. And as I pointed out, coming to terms with the British was for them is the best of the compromises that they could make, rather than the adventures of supporting Tipu in South India. Also worth noting that throughout the trip of these emissaries, to the extent that we know, as they arrived in Bushehr, then Shiraz, then Tehran, the British had their own agents. That's very interesting. This 1790s is very early that they had supporters, particularly in Shiraz, that they prevent the coming of these emissaries into the Qajar capital. Why? Because the British wanted to get rid of Tipu first and then send emissaries of their own. And this is the rest of the stories. You can see, I just give you some chronology. You need not to worry about this one too much. We don't have time for it. But this we know. Tipu Sultan writes to an unknown renegade prince returning to Iran. We don't know who that was. In 1797, 2 years before his being slayed, in which he says, after you have made your arrangements regarding the capital of the Sultanate of Persia, it is my wish that you and I, in concert with Zaman Shah, this is the Durrani ruler of Afghanistan, should endeavor to regulate and put in order the countries of the Hindustan and Deccan. So that's how he wants to invite them to come to his rescue in the south. If you move further, we see a number of letters. This is what I discovered in Cardington Library in Oxford, very written in Persian to the French governor of Mauritius in Persian, in which he urges him to become an ally of Tipu Sultan because Mauritius was in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So as a kind of a strategic support for him vis-a-vis the British. So the letters are quite interesting, actually. And then more of the timeline, as I said, 1799, you can see that the Sultanate disappears. What happens in 1799 is, well, let me show you this as well. The British produce a victory coin, victory medal, and it's actually quite interesting. On the one side, as you can see, I'm sorry. You can see this is the Lion of the British Empire, is basically killing the tiger of Mysore, and rather, I would say sarcastically, you see the flag at the top is a British flag here, and says Asadullah al-Ghalib, which is absolutely remarkable. This is in a sense that Asadullah al-Ghalib is on their side. It's not on the side of Tipu Sultan. And in the back of it, as you can see here, this is the, what do you call it, the obverse. You would see that it's the reverse. The obverse is the other side. The reverse, you would see this is the Srinapatam in fire after it was taken over by the British. And at the bottom of it, it says Srinarang Patan, which is the same as Srinapatam. Ziqa'de 1213. And then using the term Khodadad, which is the title, kind of a messianic title that Tipu had for himself. This is his title that we are using in this victory medal. So by itself, I think it was incredibly sarcastic of the British to produce this, but at the same time shows their sensitivity concerning Tipu Sultan. Once this ends, we see that the British have a great hopes or engagement with Iran because they think it still is a great power in the region, so that could stabilize the region now that they are getting rid of Tipu Sultan. So they send Sir John Malcolm, then John Malcolm, Captain John Malcolm, he was still very young. He was the kind of a whiz kid of the British in the south, and he knew Persian very well. He knew everybody, extremely well connected. good scholar, had written several histories of southern India, and then, of course, later on, the 2-volume history of Persia. So he was the kind of person who knew everything. It was quite a genius, actually, John Malcolm. So when he was commissioned to go to Iran, or sent over by the Governor General of India, Wellesley, he was consulting with another Shushtari figure who has written a fantastic account of in Persian, called Tuhfatul Alam, in which he gives an account that he was summoned by Malcolm to Bombay, where he would give some advice about the king of Iran. They know very little about what's going on in Iran. So here, he basically says that in the climate of arrogance, one thing that never entered their minds was English domination. That is Iranians. Tasallut Englisiye says the Iranians cannot be conquered. That is the advice of Shushtari. I would go fast because I want to come to an end. And then, of course, there are a number of other passages in support of the new kingship of Iran that was produced under the Qajars. So there's a lot of glorification of Iran at this time. And then when Malcolm reaches Tehran in 1800, that's about the time that the emissary Abdurrahman of Tipu Sultan was asked to leave because the British are coming back. British are coming, not coming back. For the first time, are coming to Tehran. And this is interesting. This is Marquis Wellesley Richard, that's the brother of Wellington, who instructs John Malcolm in 1799, immediately after the collapse of Tipu, to go to Iran. And then the passage that it's in yellow, you can see, you will particularly advert to the gross calumny of Tipu Sultan, is now known to have industriously calculated in every Mohammedan state about the beginning of the present state, beginning of the present year, and which impute to the British government in India an avowed design to destroying every Muslim power in Asia. So he sent him to say to the Fath Ali Shah that this is not the case. It will be easy for you to demonstrate its ultimate falsehood and absurdity, even to the most bigoted Mohammedans. This is part of the message, part of the instructions that was given by Wellesley to Malcolm to come to Iran. That's where he is. He comes with an enormous amount of presents to Fath Ali Shah, that, as a matter of fact, creates a lot of complaints. But it says you have bankrupt the East India Company by sending all of these gifts to the Shah of Iran. And you can see he was received in this painting very kind of kindly by the ruler of Iran, graciously by the ruler of Iran. And this is the beginning of establishing relations prior to coming of the French. So in 2 episodes, this is the first episode. And then, as you can see here, although Iran loses provinces in the north, this is all the Caucasus that were lost to Iran. Iran nevertheless manages to maintain to much of the central lands of Iran, except perhaps for, I'm sorry, I never learned. I'm sorry. Here, the western provinces of today's Afghanistan, Herat, which was part and parcel of Iran and was lost, basically it was under the British pressure, was lost to the Qajars in the middle part of the century, after 3 campaigns that they fought and lost. So this brings us really to an end. The general observations: failure of the Mysore project, that become part of this grand alliance that gets nowhere. Failure of the Napoleonic French connection, that doesn't work either. So giving in to the British diplomatic pressure. So basically that's the best option for Iranians, basically at this time. And then Qajar Iran, loss of prestige, that's what I referred to earlier on. And that became very apparent after Turkmenchai. Limited resources that keeps Iran as a weak part of the arrangement that the British wanted to make, but it turns it into a buffer state, which I said is a blessing in disguise in a sense. That means allows Iran to survive. Is containment and survival through negotiation. That's what becomes the rubric of the Qajars throughout the course of the latter part of the 19th century, or the early part as well. They resist, but they compromise. So I think this is a kind of gives this politics of appeasement a more positive a kind of a perspective, that this is something that actually managed to allow Iran to survive for the whole of a very tumultuous period, which virtually all of the countries in the region, as well as much of the countries in the Eastern Hemisphere, became colonies of the British or the French or the Russian annexation. So in a sense, their survival is quite remarkable. It's one of the very few countries in the world that, perhaps 4 or 5, that by the end of the 19th century still remained independent, despite all the pressure on them. This is still on the map. When you look at them, they are independent countries. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Navina Naqvi. I'm Assistant Professor of Persianate Islamic Cultures of South Asia, and I have been following Dr. Amanat's work for more time than I care to admit, for over a decade at least. And so it is a great pleasure. The pleasure is mine, being able to moderate a Q&A with you. I really enjoyed this talk, as I'm sure everybody else in the audience did. I'd like to maybe just begin with, we don't have a ton of time, so maybe what I'll do is start with a comment that will then lead into an abstract question, and then we'll take maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if that sounds like a...
By all means, anytime.
Okay. So I was really intrigued by this wonderful story of Iran's narrow escape from British colonialism, which seems to be sort of what ties...
Or Russian annexation on the other side.
Annexation, yes. Which seems to be what ties it all together. And as a scholar of South Asia, I was particularly interested in this alliance and pipe dream that Tipu Sultan has. I wanted to actually mention that there are smaller, less glamorous versions of these alliances being hatched. So, for example, there are a bunch of runaway Mughal princes. As you know, many of them were sort of imprisoned in Delhi. Yes. Forming alliances with these sort of roguish figures and trying to go to Herat and strike an alliance with Timur Shah Durrani and then Zaman Shah at exactly the same time. And so there is this sort of general discontent with the emergence of sort of British colonialism, although it's not quite colonialism at this time. So I'm just wondering if there's like, I'm wondering about the language and the concepts that are mobilized in sort of imagining this anti-British ethos, because it's not quite anti-colonial, but it definitely is anti-British, as you referenced. And then I'm also interested in the figure of Tipu, and you showed him in this sort of Rustam-like situation and the references to the Shahnameh. And I'm wondering if what he's doing is what we describe as Persianate, or is he really envisioning something else? Because the French are filling the rank and file of his army. It's a very modern army. He's facing the Ottoman Empire, which is not quite Persianate.
Yes.
And so is he also imagining a new kind of modern Muslim imperial form, or is he an extension of this kind of Persianate tradition? So I'll end my 2 cents over there, and then I'll ask you for a response, and then we'll have one or two questions.
Sure. To be brief, as far as the second question is concerned, the second comment is concerned, it seems to me that there's a mix of the two. Okay. I mean, if you have his dream book, in which he writes in Persian, and he talks about Saadi and Nizami and the revival of the Mughal Empire and so forth, you can imagine that he is still thinking in that context of a Persianate world that he thinks he shares all the way into the Persian into Iran. So in that context, I think he still is very much a Persianate, very much a Persianate. Or in Qawaid Nizam that was written by Zainul Abidin Shushtari, you would find that still very much it's couched in a very typical Persian kind of a context with poetry in the middle of it. Some of the poetry, of course, is in Urdu. So it's a shift from Persian to Urdu, you can see in some of this, particularly when it comes to the troops, So but at the same time, you're absolutely right. I mean, part of this ideology of trying to persuade Iranians to come to his rescue by putting pressure in Punjab over the British it seems to me there's a kind of a new imagination. So in a sense, he thinks in more modern terms. In many respects, what I've read from him is a mix of the two. And sometimes you would find him is very focused on the issues. In other times, you would find him, he goes to hunting at the day or a week before that he's supposed to get into a campaign. So, or when the British governor of Deccan, not the governor of Deccan, British commander of the forces in the south writes to him, Kirkpatrick, writes to him in the letters, it's the British Library letters, you would see that the way that he responds is very kind of a, what do you say, not serious. It still says, I paid no attention to you, knowing that there is a huge danger there. So I would say his attitude is shifting between the two. He's a man of two words in a sense. So your point is very well taken. As far as the first point is concerned, I'm not really a historian of South Asia, so I know bits and pieces here and there. One that I know is a kind of a latter, it's around 1870s, when you see one of these renegade princes of the Mughal Empire, or claims to be a prince of the Mughal Empire, comes to Iran. And he starts from the south. I think he comes from Kandahar, comes into Khorasan. I think goes to Mashhad. And then from Mashhad, he wants to come to the court of Nasiruddin Shah because he thinks he can take refuge in the court of... And Nasiruddin Shah don't want to have anything to do with him. So all the time, he writes these letters. Why we know about all of these letters of begging Nasiruddin Shah to give him the protection is that the British were following him step by step. So they're a kind of an obsession by this minor figure who probably wasn't very important, but you have one after the other in British Archive. You have these accounts about this particular prince. And he eventually, Nasiruddin Shah manages to persuade him to leave Iran and go to Karbala, and in a sense, Mujawer shud. He became a kind of a resident of Karbala, and the British give up on him then. So there is a sense of overemphasis on these figures, which means that after 57, the Indian revolt, or Indian revolution, you would say, they were afraid that there might be another example of that kind of an uprising, that kind of a rebellion against the British. And I suppose even during the British Crown ruling over India, this kind of a sense of fear continued all through up to the 20th century, to the extent that I am familiar with. So I can say that the memory of Mughal Empire died far later than the actual disappearance of it. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, any questions from the audience? Yes.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. You talked about the subtleties of the Turkmenchai Treaty and how the younger generation of Iranians have a negative view on it. My understanding is that it's more of a lesson of what happens if you go against a stronger power and instigate something in response to Golestan, and you get into a worse situation in which Maqam Farahani has to come around and help Iran out and get the best of that really bad situation. So can you touch upon how essentially that mistake of trying to correct for Golestan maybe affected the Qajar attitude further on to deal with the Russians?
Yes. Well, actually, it's a great question. I think one can argue that it took the Iranians a while before they would realize that what kind of a nemesis they have in the north. This was the Russian Empire that defeated Napoleon at the same time, that is 1812. But I'm sorry, a little bit earlier, 1810, or they defeated Napoleon in the battlefield at the same time that they fought against Iranians in the Caucasus and against the Ottomans in Western Caucasus. So they fought against all three of them and won. So that was an army that basically had no rival. Even the British were very aware of the fact that this is the greatest European army of the 19th century, and they cannot mess with it. They did a lot, but they usually, even the alliances against the Russians were soon crumbling. So in that respect, Iranians cannot be really, cannot be blamed for the fact that the loss of these provinces for them didn't give the message that they don't have the technological or military advances or privileges to fight with a very modern army that ever since the time of Peter has been modernized. They didn't have the sense that that Iran had about 4 million population with very limited resources compared to at least 60 to 80 million population of the Russian Empire. That was constantly growing, constantly expanding. So in effect, this was completely a difficult task for Iranians to try to defend these provinces. They should be very lucky that they stopped in Tabriz and then left Azerbaijan or southern Azerbaijan for whatever they managed to get in the Caucasus. So in that regard, I think they came to, of course, understanding came later. The latest of it is in Marv in the 1860s, when Nasiruddin Shah was badly defeated. And they realized that there's no chance for military action. Compromise. Just give and take. So that was basically the message for them.
We have time for a last question.
So, as actually follow-up maybe of the previous question, we read a lot about the amount of shock and like surprise the Iranian armies and like Abbas Mirza had facing like the Russian army and seeing the advancement. And also you mentioned that then the Qajars tried to like balance the power between the British and the Russians, and how like Tipu's emissaries warned the Qajar court about the British like imperial ambitions. So how long did it take for the Qajar dynasty, and like through which like channels, they understood the like amount of like the British colonialism and their ambitions and like their differences between the Russians, because it seems that they weren't aware that like what is the grand plan of the British and the Russian at the time. So how did they like find out the extent of their politics and military plans, and they found the like right amount of the balance?
Well, difficult to put a date on it, but it seems to me that in 1810, when the French were asked to leave, Joubert mission was asked to leave, and the British were allowed to enter, because once before, Malcolm came three times to Iran, one in 1800 that we saw, one in 1808 or thereabout, that he was not allowed by Fath Ali Shah to come beyond Bushehr. So he said, you are not welcome. And then again in 1810, when he comes back to Iran. The third time, the Iranian realized that the best of the two bad situations is to come to terms with the British. And I think it was the right decision, because except for one occasion, when during Palmerston in 1857, the British sent Sepoy army and the British Navy to the Persian Gulf, and they came all the way up to Qajar. Iranians immediately, and then Nasruddin said, whatever you want, we are not going to have anything to do with Herat anymore. So they lost Herat because they realized that the danger of the British is serious. But before and after that, there was a resistance against the British to gave them great degree of respect, considered them as their allies, but did not allow them much get into the interior of Iran. Very successful, particularly after 1887, when the British took over Egypt after the Suez Canal. Nasruddin Shah was very alert of the everyday affair around the world. So he was reading the papers all the time. So he realized that there is no way that he could allow the British to come into the interiors of Iran. So in a matter of at least a decade, Iranians, if you look at the documentations as the correspondence in the British Archive, you would see it took the British for a whole decade to negotiate with Iran navigation through the Karun River into the interior of Iran. And eventually, the concession that was given was not to the British. Nasruddin Shah said, this is an international waterway. We open it up to everybody, including the British, that they can take advantage of it. And never allowed it to have the kind of exclusive control over that waterway. So it was for him very crucial to realize that if the Egyptians built or Suez Canal was built and eventually taken over, and the whole of Egypt was taken by the British under the High Commissioner, it could have happened to Iran as well. So there is a resistance on the side of Iran. This is often forgotten. Some of the correspondence of the Iranians from the 1860s in their negotiations over the Paris Peace Treaty 1857, you can see that the Iranians are paying very skillfully. They lost Herat, but they managed to keep the rest of the country. Herat was much more integral part of Iran, because it was Darus-Saltaneh. It was the second capital of the Safavid period. So it was something like Tabriz or like Qazvin or like Isfahan. It was a major Iran center. They lost it, but they lost the periphery. They couldn't keep it. There's a reality was that they couldn't keep it, but they realized that they can keep the center as a result. If I say just one minor point, that when I draw the comparison with contemporary situation in Iran, you see compromise is the only choice that Iranians have. And I hope they listen that and they realize that this is the, historically speaking, all those adventures of troops keeping Hezbollah in Lebanon, all of that business is not going to get Iran in anywhere. Iran's choice from the past always has been compromised. And whenever it hasn't done that, has lost tremendously, ever since the Sasanian times. So it's a very painful story, but it's a very realistic one.
That brings us to the end of the Q&A. Please give Dr. Amanat a round of applause.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. On behalf of the Alireza Ahmadian Lecture Series and also the Department of Asian Studies, I'd like to extend our deepest thanks to Dr. Abbas Amanat for this very insightful and thought-provoking lecture. By the way, Dr. Amanat has generously accepted. If you have any questions that you didn't get a chance to share, you might actually want to email him. We have I'm not sure how much time you would have in the future for that, but at least he has accepted to receive them. And very quickly, we'd also, of course, love to hear your thoughts on how we do our job. We are always open to improving how we do things in the future. So if you have a couple of minutes, we'd appreciate you completing it now. And if not, of course, you can scan the QR code and do this later. And finally, of course, we hope to see you in our future events, which will be basically, will resume from the next academic year. Thank you very much again, everyone, and please enjoy the reception. Thank you.
Thank you.